If Hi, my name's Lou Eisen, and this is Ring Talk, and we welcome you to a very special show. If talent were height, this man would be 1,000 feet tall. His name is Nigel Collins. He's the preeminent boxing writer in the world for a long time. He's one of my true heroes. He's been writing about professional boxing for more than 50 years, and he's been writing about it better than any man alive. He's had 2 terms as editor in chief of the Ring magazine. I mean, I bought Ring because he was writing for it. Other platforms that he's written for include ESPN.com, HBO, of course, Showtime, Ringside Seat, where he's a regular contributor, and his articles are still absolutely magnificent. Boxing News, KO Magazine, Boxing Illustrated, World Boxing. His book, Boxing Babylon, was published in 1990, and you can still get that. It's a wonderful book. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame unanimously in 2015. Other honors include the Pennsylvania Boxing Hall of Fame, the Atlantic City Boxing Hall of Fame, and the Rocky Marciano Award for Excellence in Boxing Coverage. He's the benchmark. Nigel Collins is the benchmark against which all other boxing writers are measured. And then he also has won the prestigious James J. Walker Award for long and meritorious service to boxing. That James J. Walker was the mayor of New York who legalized boxing in New York. That's an extremely rare and prestigious award. Nigel was born in England, but luckily for us, he now resides in the Philadelphia area. This is his new book, Hooking Off the Jab, with that wonderful photo of Terry Norris and Donald Curry. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Nigel Collins.
Hey, I'm back.
Great to see you.
Yeah, it's just we've been trying to do this for a while, and now we're finally going to do it.
Yes, you got sick, and then I got sick. And I didn't believe it was happening, but one of those things.
Conspiring against us.
Yes, the hooking off the jab, I loved it, and you have a million great stories in there, and the one that really touched my heart was the one on Sunny Banks, and people get overly dramatic when they describe the death of a fighter, but you did it so perfectly. I don't mean that in a sarcastic way. I mean, you did it in such a touching way. You just presented the raw truth, which was tough enough in itself.
That was actually that was an assignment that Bill Detloff gave me that I didn't want to do.
Oh, really?
But he encouraged me, and I'm damn glad that he did. It was more like an investigative reporting job than like a straightforward feature. And as you know, I got very close to the family who had actually managed Sunny Banks. And the person who could have given me some information didn't want to be interviewed. But yeah, it was a sad person, and I think that fight with Williams was Cleveland Williams was so stupid.
Hmm.
I mean, I gave several theories, and one of them was that the managers were just want to cash out. They had invested money in him, but I think that's the fight. Very often, before somebody is fatally injured in a fight, there's a heavy beating. With Benny Kid Paret, it was Gene Fullmer.
Right.
It was a lot of people. So I thought they were, I hated them for that.
Good reason.
But I don't really know the news story. Maybe I gave an alternative that he was short of money, he wanted to get married and stuff like that. But and I was very lucky. The gentleman who was actually there that I quoted, Jeff Jowett, he's a friend of mine, and whenever there's an old fight that I didn't see, he's a little bit older than me, and his description of it was, very, very good. And I was lucky to get that, and it was also lucky to get a lot of the newspaper clippings from all over. So yeah, it was sad, but some boxing can be sad. But actually, a couple of people that I respect liked it. Obviously, Bill Detloff and Russell Peltz, the promoter and friend.
Yeah.
He said it was wonderful. So
Because
sad.
of
But I
both.
think it was, yeah. And there was one thing that I couldn't do. Um, when it was actually in Ringside Seat, I had a sidebar about Leotis Martin, the guy he was fighting when he died, but the publisher couldn't just fit sidebars into the format of the book. But anyway,
Right.
yeah, he was he could punch. Oh
And
boy, he could punch. Yeah.
blind in one eye, wasn't he?
I don't know. He had to quit, but when he, his big win, we knocked out Sonny Liston, and
Hmm.
then he found out that he had a detached retina. He may
Right.
have had it before. You never know, because a lot of these guys say, I'm going to fight anyway. And back then, they didn't have the laser surgery that we had today, and many
Right.
fighters can recover from torn retinas and stuff like that.
Right. It's interesting with Banks. Unfortunately, there's been so many incidents like that. I know Angelo Dundee told me that after the Fulmer fight, he spoke to Manuel Alfaro, the manager of Benny Kid-Brett, and he said he's done. He's a shot fighter, and he's got nothing left. And if you put him in with Griffith or anyone, he'll get killed. And he said Alfaro said to him, if he does, I'll go to Cuba and get someone else. So that I don't doubt that those managers did that, and unfortunately, it still goes on today because you obviously, being the premier boxing writer on the planet, you've seen tens, if not hundreds of thousands of fights where you must have been thinking, Nigel, what's the corner doing? This guy's been taking a beating
Yeah,
this long. Why aren't
I,
they acting?
sometimes it's not necessarily what you're seeing, but you get a feeling.
Hmm.
Um, and usually that feeling's right. You just get a funny, okay, this is bad. And, because there was a lot of vicious fights back and forth that nobody's going to die. But there's one quote that's been used quite a bit from me. The first fight between then Matthew Franklin, who became Matthew Saab Muhammad, of course, and Marvin Johnson at the Spectrum,
Right.
was even more vicious than when Matt won the title. It was the only fight that I've covered ringside where I thought maybe both guys would die.
Right. That was in Russell Peltz's book. That was a
Yeah,
fantastic book.
yeah, that was. I gave him the best quote. That's right.
You certainly do, as well as the best articles.
I wrote the foreword or the introduction, not the foreword, whatever. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. Trying to tell some of the stories about Russell that most people don't know.
You're not going to remember this, but you were a not only tremendous inspiration, but I called the ring office 15, 20 years ago, maybe not that long ago, and I spoke to you because I wanted to do a book on George Dixon. I didn't know where to start. And I was so touched that you took like a half hour out of your schedule to talk to me and encourage me. While in the background, all I could hear is, Nigel, I need you to look at this photo now. Nigel, you got to look at the article now. There's no time. Now. Tell him you later. No, I'm talking to this young man. It's rude. I will look at that in a minute. And so I really wanted to say thank you because you were so polite while you were being assaulted by all these different voices.
Yeah, I mean, I like to help people, especially they're going to try and do something in boxing. And, it's also the writers. I gave many writers their voice. And it wasn't just because I was altruistic, it was because they were good. And, yeah, and the more they write, the better they got. I had some sense of that. And of course, Bill was one of them. Don Stradley was one of them. Eric Raskin was one of them. A whole pile of guys. But there was a lot of dead wood at the ring at that particular point as far as writers go. And I didn't want that because I would spend an awful lot of time rewriting. I was good at rewriting, but you just didn't have the time with such a small staff.
Right.
So it wasn't just to be nice to these guys. It was that they could help me too because their material was pretty clean. So it worked both ways. I helped them and they helped me. I didn't help you, but the Dixon book was written. Have you read it?
Yes, my friend Jason Winders wrote it. I helped him with it with some of the
I
information. I'm trying to pivot and take my information and do a book on George Budge Byers or the original George Godfrey, of which I've now have a lot of information on.
oh well, that's good. Hurry
But
up, beat everybody to the punch.
yes, that's I think that's the important thing. I have a book I just finished that'll be coming out in the
Oh
next
yeah,
couple of weeks. Boxing's greatest controversies. I picked 25 fights and then
there's
blunder.
plenty of those. Yeah, that should be interesting.
Well, hopefully, I mean, when I got it back from the publisher, there were mistakes added in that I hadn't sent in my original manuscript. So that was kind of frustrating. But, as Angelo said, yelling or getting angry at someone's not going to progress your cause. So just be calm and polite. And
Well, sometimes, whether it's a book or a story, magazine, if the person you're talking to is good at their job, they'll tell you why. I wrote a book that it was finally published, and but one of the agents that turned it down said, "Well, this is really good. You're well written. It's funny in parts, and but publishers like a story with an arc, and it didn't have an arc. It sort of slammed the brakes on. But
right,
I afterwards found somebody that was a very important person in the book that I hadn't seen in 45 years, and I finally found them. And I went to Mexico to visit this old friend of mine, and the arc was completed
oh,
because he's in the very beginning and the very end, and so that's maybe if I'd have had that when I sent it to the literary agent, he would have helped me. But he did help me by telling me that's what I needed. I needed an
well, that's
arc.
great. We have I don't know if you know Anthony Morrow writes in that my grandfather is Leonard Morrow. I don't know who Leonard Morrow is. Do you know?
Well, I guess he was probably a fighter or something. I'm not really familiar with him.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought it might be someone that you knew. Um,
I
so
don't know much at all. This is me to put this in there. A lot of people think I'm an historian. I'm not an historian. I'm a guy who knows where to look.
right, but you were great on the Sonny. I mean, you've been on so many documentaries, and the Sonny Liston documentary, you were wonderful in that. But you displayed in the documentary and in your writing the same quality. I think the most recent example is Bud Crawford when he was perfectly calm in the pocket against Errol Spence.
Man, that was magnificent.
He was wonderful. He was like a throwback to the old time fighters. But it reminded me of you because you don't get caught up in all these I saw Elvis and I saw this and I saw that. You're very, very calm. So I emailed you after the Liston thing and I said Angelo told me that his brother told him it was a hot shot by the mob. And you said yes, that's one of the theories, but no one knows definitively what actually killed Sonny Liston, and we may never know.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people involved they're dead now too. You
Right.
know what I mean? Sean Assell wrote the book that Showtime documentary was based on, and he
Mhm.
attacked it like a cold case. He was a writer, but not a boxing writer per se. And he gave his hint to who he thought it was, but there, I think that the thing is, Las Vegas was created by gangsters,
Mhm.
and the gangsters are still there.
Yeah.
They just wear better suits these days and have corporate names, and they're not killing people, but the way that fights are fixed now are through the officials, not by giving anybody people money. So.
Right.
And I've told some people that, like, if you have a fight in Las Vegas, say Floyd Mayweather, who had an awful lot of fans and very good at the pay-per-view, um, and he fights somebody else that's not quite as popular, and it's close in Vegas, they're always going to go to the guy who creates the most money.
Right.
You know, so say Pacquiao had given Mayweather a good fight. but lost a close decision. Um, they always give it to the guy who creates the most money because the gaming industry runs the state.
Right. And you know, in that regards with those fighters, it I mean, Larry Merchant said that, and I'm sure you know this, but he said that the actual mob left, but they were replaced by the sanctioning bodies. And the thing is, the fans, I think there's a general uprising all over the planet over finances, over politics, everywhere. But fans in boxing, I mean, when they see some guy who's dominated another fighter, and now on every broadcast on ESPN, Showtime, The Zone, whatever broadcast you're watching, there'll always be, as you know, Nigel, there'll always be some blow by blow announcer who says, "Well, he has scored 3 knockdowns, he's dominated the fight, but." You know, it's boxing. We don't know how the judges see it,
Oh yeah,
and that's
I
just
mean it's well you know there's a piece in the book.
the
I,
PED.
yeah, I stole the title from the Touch of Evil movie. Oh, Touch of Larceny. That's what it was called.
Mhm.
Boxing's open secret, where I explain how they do it, and it's really heartbreaking for the fighters who should have won that don't. I don't know how, you know, every now and then you see a fighter attack a judge, or, but, you know, that's not going to do much good. Yeah, it's, well, the whole thing is that I tell people if you can't write about boxing, you can't write about anything because
Mhm.
everything's going on, and you know there's all sorts of stuff that you know behind the scenes, and then there's the fighters, and then there's the fights themselves, and you know their stories. I have a highly unscientific theory that most all boxers came to boxing emotionally wounded. Uh, they didn't get emotionally wounded in boxing. They, you know, whatever it was, even if you know, just a poor kid who didn't have enough food, that would be traumatic. You
Right.
know,
Or Ali, who had his bike stolen, who was genuinely upset.
yeah, yeah. And so yeah, it's. Sometimes I think I sold my soul to the devil to get involved in this, but hey, it's what I can do. That's
Well,
basically it. It's what I was given. You know.
when we had Bill Deloff on, I asked him this question I'm going to ask you, and I'm sure you have the same answer. But you know, the criminal element's been involved in boxing for since the 1700s. Is there really any way to ferret it out? I mean, it's really seems like it's part and parcel of the game.
Well, you mentioned the alphabet groups, and I followed Burt Sugar as being, you know, one of their main adversaries. Um, I created, I bought back the ring championship belt. We came up with a new championship, you know, who could do it, who couldn't. A very basic set of the rules based on old time rules. And it got a lot of publicity, and ESPN had me up there to Bristol, and they were very, very positive. They liked what was happening. But the thing is, I'll tell you this little thing. There was a manager, I won't name him, he's passed on now, friendly guy, called me up when we first started this new thing. And he was asking me some questions where he seemed very favorable, you know, he liked it. And I said, well, listen, I just want to tell you something. I said, you can't buy your way up the rankings. You know, we don't do that. You know, you go to one of their conventions, they give them a lot of money. Um, so he never called me back again after I told him that
Wow.
because the managers and the promoters, and to a good degree, they're all complicit.
Yeah,
And I want to scream every time they say on Showtime, it's the four belt era. That's what they call it. And I've I've always the guy said there's one world that can only one world champion. I mean, that's
that's right.
just so simple. But so I think the alphabet organizations, if we could wave a magic wand and they'd all disappear instead of multiplying, that would be a huge step because the people, managers, promoters, networks, whoever else is trying to, do things their own way would be much more difficult.
Right.
Uh,
There's a manager promoter here, or not here, excuse me, in New York, and we always debate about or argue about the in a friendly way about the IBF, and he says because I wrote a chapter about the criminality in my book, and he said they're not criminals, and he mentioned 4 or 5 guys, and I said, but they're all in prison. They were all FBI caught all of them. Well, the FBI's wrong, but they were convicted in court. The court's wrong. Well, not everyone can always be wrong all the time. It's just not possible. They
well,
were.
of course, Bob Lee did spend some time in prison
Mhm.
and banned from boxing forever. But the main charge he was acquitted on. I think it was the old tax thing, like they called Al Capone.
Right.
Um, I can't remember which one of the felonies he'd been charged with, but it was the least of the crimes.
Yeah, there was a fighter from Canada, cruiserweight, Troy Ross,
I remember
and
him.
yeah, and he's a Canadian Olympian, and he fought in Germany for Sauer against a Sauerland fighter. Won, I can't remember what it was, and he dropped the guy twice. On one knockdown, the referee helped the boxer up, like he lifted him up, and of course Troy's trainers screaming, "You're not allowed to do
Right.
that. That fight should be over." And and of course it goes to a cards, and Troy loses. And then I read in the FBI report that that was one of the fights that the IBF had made sure that their champion, because Troy hadn't wouldn't sign with them, that their champion prevailed. And I sat there in disbelief. But this has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you
Yeah,
know they did
it
it.
is.
Yeah, and it's sad.
I don't think you could ever get rid of all of the hanky panky, but and now I don't think you can get rid of the alphabet groups. I mean, I fought them for years, years and years. And when we had the new championship policy, that was the closest we ever got. Now, here I tell you something. Um, Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant, I'm friendly with them. Larry Merchant used to live in Philly when he was the sports editor of the Daily News there. Um, it's just the way it is. They were very supportive on at first on HBO. They would mention, it's for the WBC and the ring belt, and then they decided, not obviously the on-air talent, the corporate entity decided that he told the broadcasters not to mention the ring championship anymore. Now HBO's gone now, so
Mhm. Yeah, they
uh,
ran it into the ground.
yeah, I mean it was building, and when you've got Larry Merchant and Jim Lampley, Lampley sent me an email. Uh, that I guess he wasn't supposed to send but he's not there now, and neither is the person who sent him the email, telling them that not to mention the Ring Magazine Championship. So that ended it. Now they mention it all the time,
Right,
but
it's the standard.
they're still the managers and promoters are still taking huge chunks of money out of the fighters' purse to pay these organizations. It's nuts. The
Yeah.
fighters are just so anxious to get to a certain point. But when they do, they have power. And I think one of the fighters who decided that he wouldn't pay any of the sanctioning fees, he'd just fight for our belt, was the guy that knocked out Roy Jones the second time.
Carver,
Yeah.
Antonio
So,
Carver.
yeah. Even Lennox Lewis, when he finally unified the title, um, I went out to, it was a photo shoot and an interview. He was filming a commercial somewhere in New York, and there's a lot of downtime when they're filming. And he said, well, I wish we could melt all the belts down and make one. And I said, well, here it is. Here's the ring belt. That represents a real champion, not a titleist, not a belt holder. And like they say, it used to be back, I guess it sort of ended around the 60s and the 70s, that boxing fans could name every contender in all 8 weight classes.
I was about to say
Kids in
that. Yeah,
school could do that.
yeah.
But greed, let's face it, practically all the problems in this world are caused by greed. And boxing's right in there. Let's talk about something good about boxing.
Well, here's yes, but I have one question, which has always puzzled me. I mean, boxing's huge in England, and boxing's huge in Germany, and but the majority of revenues from sanctioning bodies come from the United States. How come the United States can't have more power in how it's run? It
Well,
should have more power.
basically, the main thing is money.
Okay.
Okay. They pay more. But the other thing is, if you're living, say, in England, like I remember Ricky Hatton was so excited to fight in Las Vegas, the bright lights, they want to do that. And it used to be more, they wanted to fight at Madison Square Garden.
Right.
And that's died down now because there's more fights in Brooklyn than there are in Manhattan these days. And, they want that. Now, practically everybody that I gave a championship belt to knew what it represented. But maybe they just weren't brave enough to go against the flow.
Was Muhammad Ali the most special person you ever met in your entire life?
Well, I didn't really meet him.
Oh, okay.
And much, yeah. Did you read the
Yeah,
3
you
articles I
left
wrote around
before.
his funeral? Yeah.
Yeah, you left before
Um,
the fight. I thought you'd met him otherwise.
no, I told basically, all of it in those three. Those three stories were written under deadline in a matter of just a couple of days, and my editor said I knocked the ball out of the park.
Yeah, you did.
And the thing that I think made a difference was after the funeral itself, the day of the funeral itself. Um, Most everybody in the media interviewed other fighters or people that are involved in boxing. I interviewed the people who were waiting outside to go in. And, a lot of them, they had a relationship with them. He used to go to school with my brother and things like that. So, what I've tried to do for a long time now is try and find an angle nobody else is using, because there's a lot of cookie cutter stories out there, especially now the internet.
Hmm.
Newspapers used to have good writers at one point. So I always try to look at things are maybe a little bit different. So, whether the story's good or not, that's what I try to do.
Right. I know that there's a misconception in the print media, anyways, that certainly in Canada, but also in the States, except for England, that they just don't cover boxing. So I haven't seen a fight covered in a local or national newspaper. Only one newspaper in Canada, a conservative paper, gives it a bit of coverage.
Well,
But
obviously newspapers are all dying, so that's a
right,
big part of it.
right.
But it wasn't, things were going down as far as coverage was concerned before the internet.
Hmm.
But at least, we had 2 newspapers in Philadelphia. We had 4 at once. and they all covered boxing. But then it got okay. They've only got enough in the budget to go to Las Vegas 3 times this year, or something like that, And it's like Bernard Fernandez, who was a longtime boxing
Great
writer.
writer.
Yeah, he used to always say the same thing that the Eagles and the Phillies, if they were lions, they eat the good part, and boxing's left over for the buzzards.
Yeah, it's every. I know in Canada that all the major networks have got rid of all their sports programming. So you'll have the weather girl give the weather, and then she'll have the Toronto Blue Jays or the Toronto Maple Leafs score, and that's it.
Well, what happened is that sports editors in the newspaper towards the last 10, 15 years of their existence, and naturally on TV, they don't know anything about boxing. So if somebody gets killed, they're going to run it. If somebody gets arrested, they're going to run it. But you could have had one of the greatest fights of all time on Saturday night, and they won't mention it. Why? Because they don't know. Now, the thing that they should do is learn. Learn about it. But they haven't. And all of the boxing writers who did the boxing beats were all laid off. I know Bernie, he took like one of those severance packages because he knew he was going to get the axe anyway. And a lot of writers like that.
There's a guy here
Ring
in Toronto.
Magazine's mostly digital now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. There was a guy here who retired from a newspaper, the Toronto Sun, Steve Buffrey. He wrote about boxing for 50 years. And when I asked him why he retired, he said, I got tired of being yelled at. Why yell at me? I'm just proposing a boxing story.
And the strange thing is, boxing generates a huge amount of money.
Yeah. More than UFC, more than MMA, but they just won't listen to the numbers.
The one between the latest fight with Crawford, and they were surprised that they sold 700,000 pay-per-views, because I don't think Crawford had even up to 200,000, and his others pay-per-views, and that's why Bob Laram let him go. But when you make a big fight and people want it, and what was that fight?
Anthony Joshua?
No, it was the fight that a lightweight fight. Let me see.
Haney Lomachenko.
No. Gervonta Davis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Garcia.
And Garcia. They would have been happy with 500,000 pay-per-views, but they had like 1.2 million. That was a huge surprise. And me and Bill Detloff often go to a bar to watch a pay-per-view because we don't want to pay $100. And we went to one in Allentown where he lives, and we called up on the phone. He said, well, it's already standing room only, but you can come if you want. And we went, and they only charged us $10 to get in, right? But the drinks were expensive. So, that's how they made their money. But, that was a fight that was huge,
I have to say, though, what I find extremely frustrating is when you speak to people on sports radio or television or newspapers and you say, you don't have to believe me, but numbers don't lie. Math never lies. So here's the gates for boxing for the previous 5 big fights. And here's the pay-per-view numbers and the live gates. And here's for UFC or MMA. And boxing always does better. And they just don't care.
Well, I think also the MMA fighters don't earn as much money most of them.
No, what they earn is
it's sort of like a job, right? You're getting a salary. Yeah.
Those top fighters earn $50,000 on MMA. if you're the top fighter of the card, and that would be a per diem
Yeah,
for
a middle class boxer would be happy with that, but
yeah,
not the big stars. Um, well, we have Jerome Boots Ennis here in Philadelphia,
great
who is
fighter,
a great fighter. I've covered a lot of his fights. His last fight was his toughest one.
and he was
I mean,
dominant.
yeah, when he was fighting in the clubs around Philadelphia, you couldn't find out much about him. He'd knock the guy out, and it was over, you know. But his most recent fight, he took some punches. Um, is he ready for Crawford? That's the fight a lot of people want to see. I'm not sure. I mean, he's a
I don't
totally
think
different kind of fighter than
Crawford doesn't. Crawford said that he just wants Charlo for the way Charlo treated him
yeah,
during the
yeah.
fight.
Well, but that fight with Ennis, it was. I couldn't believe how good Bud was, and I already thought that he was the best fighter in the world. But some of the things he did were so subtle. When he was attacked, he didn't clinch.
No,
He put his hands up like that and pushed the guy back.
yeah, he
That's
he
nobody else does that.
no, and when
They
I
grab a
watched,
hold.
yeah, and when I watched him fight Spence, it reminded me of reading about Jack Johnson or Sam Langford. It really did. The way that they could Johnson could stand in front of you and just turn his shoulder ever so slightly or turn his hips and avoid the punch, and he was so calm in the pocket. It was like you were saying, it's a throwback. It's you're watching a brilliant guy from another era.
Yeah. Now, the fight when the monster from Japan fought
In
the
New
guy
Ring.
Scooter Fulton from Philadelphia with that
Yeah,
great knockout. There was everybody would talk about who's the number one pound for pound. The pound for pound's horseshit anyway, but
right.
it's a big deal with the fighters. And as spectacular as the knockout was against the guy I knew, who was undefeated and a good fighter, that seemed to be, put him in number one. But the fact that Spence was a much better, fighter with more
Mhm.
experience against good guys. And yeah, the subtlety. He is so relaxed in the ring, and that's very, 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 very hard. Somebody's trying to knock your head off, and most fighters are not relaxed. Like a guy like Roberto Duran was very relaxed. George Foreman in his second life as a boxer was very relaxed. Before he was just a wild guy throwing haymakers.
Right.
Um, yeah, but Bud Crawford, did you see any of the videos from the parade he had in Omaha?
That was fantastic.
It was unreal. I mean,
Yeah.
it looked the streets were packed. Here he is with his fishing pole and his sawed off jeans. I mean, I didn't even know until Crawford came along that there weren't any good fighters in Nebraska.
No.
But that they turned out. I mean, I couldn't count the crowd, but sometimes when you got the long shot, you could see they were all the way down, maybe 5 or 6 deep on the sidewalk. And he's a lot happier now.
Mhm.
You usually, he's not the happiest guy in the world, but he got the big win, he got the big money, and I think I can't speak for him, but I think the people that turned out to support him was almost as important as the money. He
Oh, without
finally
a doubt.
knew more important than the money, the response of the fans in Omaha. Um,
He's also good friends with Warren Buffett. I mean, he keeps great company.
yeah, he does. I remember that. Yeah, it's he's a strange fighter. There is a story about him in the book, and he's he's a lot of people think he's not a good interview. No, you're not a good interviewer. That's some people are. I've had problems with Pernell Whitaker, for instance. Um, at one time when I was working on the KO magazine, they always had a big interview, KO interview, and had my questions already written, and it was a phoner. I had my tape recorder, and it was either yes, no, or I don't know. And that went on for about half an hour. And usually an interview is an hour or more. So I said, thank you very much, and hung up. And I gave the tape recorder to the publisher, and he says, we're not going to print that. So, most fighters are just absolutely delighted to get publicity. He was a little bit difficult. He was elevated to pound for pound at one time, and he had a jacket made. You might remember the cover. It was like a leather jacket, and it said "pound for pound" on it.
Yeah.
And he was like looking over his shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't pose for anything else, because when you want a lot of the standard shots with your clothes off and boxing poses. That's the bread and butter. That was great for a cover, but he wouldn't do anything else. Floyd Mayweather was very difficult at times. Floyd is very interesting person in that he can be real asshole, and a half an hour later he'll come up to you and apologize. There is some sort of dual personality there.
Yeah, he apologized to Larry Merchant. He apologized to Larry
It's
Merchant.
great. Larry Merchant's gonna kick his ass.
Yeah. I met Floyd once for 3 seconds. I was with Angelo Dundee. And so he only looked at me because I'm with Angelo Dundee. And he just said, hey. I said, hi, it's a pleasure to. But by the time I got to the word two, before I said meet you, he's already gone. I mean, he's somewhere else.
I remember one thing that it was me personally, when he was fighting De La Hoya, they did a tour of the country, and they came to Philadelphia, and Floyd had just won the ring belt as the welterweight champion. So I had permission to take it to him during the press conference. And when my time came, I came up, I said a few words, not much at all, gave him the belt, held his hand up. He didn't even say thank you. And a little bit later, when he was talking to the audience, he held it up like it was a dead fish. And what he said, they gave me this. So I said, well, what a prick. When it was all over, and there was like a long line of people that he went down, like, a receiving line. And when he got to me, oh, you guys are doing a great job with the Ring magazine. I want you to come out to training camp. I'm thinking, this is the same guy? So I can't really explain him, but a lot of the times he does, I guess he feels bad or he wouldn't apologize.
Right.
But those are two of the most difficult boxers that I've ever dealt with.
I know at Hall of Fame, because I'd go with Angelo. Angelo and I were in Cinderella Man together, but I first met him when he brought Jose Napoles to fight Clyde Gray in Toronto. And I waited after the fight to meet him. And I got to meet him, and he asked me if I boxed, and I said yes. And he said, are you good? I said, I'm pretty good. He said, then you should quit because you have to be special. And the size of your head, the other guy doesn't have to leave his corner to actually land a punch on you. So you're at a disadvantage. And then he said to me, do you want to meet the big guy? And Muhammad came out because he was one of the promoters. And I was 13, 14, but I just cried the whole time, even at that age, because I couldn't believe this is my hero. You're never going to meet a hero.
People like you and me, boxers, are our heroes when we're kids, and that doesn't really go away. I wrote a long piece about Dick Tiger, who was, I think the heading was, a real hero or whatever it was, that he was a hero.
Absolutely.
And I used to watch him on the TV, and he was something really special. He stood by his people at the darkest hour. And the part how he had to sneak out through a jungle trail to get to Vegas to fight Roger Rouse. He was out. And was another part that I don't know if I had it in the story. when he went to the Nigerian embassy to see if he could go home without getting arrested or something, he took Larry Merchant with him.
Wow.
Larry Merchant didn't say anything. He was just a witness. And Tiger trusted him and knew that if Larry Merchant was there, these guys couldn't say one thing and then do another. If he'd have taken a lawyer, probably wouldn't have worked. But Larry Merchant is, he's got a vehicle to express himself in, and I'm sure. But Tiger was a real gentleman, and he did sent all his money home, and he lived like in a dump. They couldn't understand why this guy that, was a top performer fighting at the Garden all the time. And I think I mentioned they doubled the normal fee for him because he attracted so many fans. Carrying his equipment around in a paper bag sometimes, and doing his laundry to keep busy between sparring and things. He was a different
The
kind of
poverty
guy.
never leaves you.
Pardon me?
The poverty never leaves you when you grow up with that.
Exactly. Subsistence farmers, that's what they were.
Yeah,
and although his grandfather was a great warrior, and his mother thought that, that he was the reincarnation of his grandfather. But some of the things that he saw, the bombing landing on homes and entire villages wiped out. I mean, it was a horrendous mismatch from the beginning, But there was genocide in the northern part of Nigeria, and it was a terrible thing. And he actually, I forget what the award is, but every year the Queen, they give certain people a little medal. I forget what it is. It's something of the British Empire.
Member of the British Order.
Yeah,
of the
right.
British.
So Dick Tiger had one of those, and he mailed it back to the Queen. And this is another little interesting thing. He got the idea to do it because John Lennon had just done it.
Right.
And, that, of course, it didn't affect the Queen and all the arms sales to the Nigerian government, but he just wanted to let them know, I don't want this piece of shit.
I know that when he got stopped by Bob Foster, my father cried. And I said,
it was tough to watch. It was.
Yeah. And my father, I said, but it's a legitimate knockout. He didn't cheat. And he said, yeah, but it's Dick Tiger. This is a man. This is someone who deserves better than this.
Well, it's chilling just to watch it for me. Watch the replay or some of the things. But that just comes with the territory. And he had that great comeback fight with DePaula, and fight of the year in the ring. So, of course, when he came here, he was 30. And it was ancient for a boxer in those days. I mean, he had a lot of fights in England. He had quite a few in Nigeria, but he had a lot of fights in England.
And he lost a lot of his early fights.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he had I think he had 4 fights with Joey Giardello. And he lost the title to him and then won the title back from Giardello. But prior to that, when they were contenders, I think they were 2-2. But Giardello, of course, was a Philadelphia fighter and a real character. He said, I don't have to train. I'm a natural. I just fight. And a lot of that was true. I went to a gym. Passyunk Avenue was a famous place in South Philly where there's a statue, not a statue, a sculptor of Joey Giardello now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, right around where the gym used to be. And so I went down the gym, and there was something on the ground floor. I don't know what it was. Then there was the gym, and then the 3rd floor was where everybody gambled. So I went in there looking for him. the gym part. Oh no, he's playing cards upstairs. So a lot of great fighters, because they have so much talent, they don't train as hard as they should. I guess it's just a real temptation. Like the
Right.
guy that I managed, Jerome Artist, beat Sugar Ray Leonard in the National Golden Gloves, but wouldn't train. So it's just it's a weird thing. Like Gypsy Joe Harris, who was a real
Right.
phenomenon.
Right.
There's a little bit of film of his last fight, which was with Emil Griffith, that really didn't show anything. He was inspiration. People would come and fill the joint when he was still in the preliminaries just to see him. And he was he looked like a little gnome. I don't mean that insultingly, but he did. And like a lot of fighters that are very good defensively, and he was very good defensively, he always made the other guy pay. And he would do all kinds of things. He would do the Jersey Joe Walcott walk away. He would go in a corner, put his hands over the two ropes, and duck every punch the guy was throwing at him. Amazing fighter. He was 21 fights or something, and he was through. He beat Curtis Cokes at the Garden, and then Curtis Cokes became the welterweight champion. And of course, everybody wanted to see Gypsy Joe fight him again and win the title. He never went. He didn't even go to Texas. I guess it was Houston or Dallas the fight was, because he knew he couldn't make weight, so he didn't go. And in a way, it's a good thing he didn't. The people who were promoting the fight were crooks, and they sold all the tickets twice. And now the fight didn't come off, because Gypsy Joe stayed in Philly. But they knew, the commission, they knew all along he only had one eye.
I have to tell you, Nigel, I did stand-up for about 30, 35 years. And the similarities between stand-up comedy and boxing in terms of criminality are frightening. That you get called up to go do a show, and they'd say, "Oh, there's no money, but you get a free dinner." And then you get to the show and you speak to the owner. "Oh, we paid the club $2,500 for you." So this would happen all the time. Or you go on the road somewhere and you're supposed to get $2,500 for the week. And you end up coming home with 700, and then they took 1,800. And you'd say to them, "Where do you get that? Where do you get the cojones to take that kind of commission?"
They're in boxing.
Yeah,
it's I haven't been ripped off too much, but the one thing for a long time, different people would want to do a documentary or wanted to do a lengthy interview. Once the bunch of guys came over from Japan just to pick my brain, and I realized that I was giving myself away for nothing. And now I charge, not going to do anything for nothing.
Your knowledge is your stock in trade. I mean, my wife always says to me, "You have these thousands of pages of archives on boxers going back a couple hundred years. And when someone calls you from the paper to ask you about a fight from 1856, you shouldn't just say, 'Yeah, I'll give it to you.' Don't give it to them.
Yeah.
You have to do work."
It's different if they're interviewing you for a story or something, but when they just want you to do, a lot of people want, this is the old line. When my office was in Manhattan, the old line was, when I was naive, well, if you come on this show, you're going to get a lot of publicity, and that'll raise you up. It didn't give me a dime, So in my old age, I got tough. I started charging them.
In stand-up, it would always be, you got a lot of exposure. You're going to get exposure. And a friend of mine who's a great comic and still doing it said, "I live in Canada. I can go outside in winter with my underwear on and die from exposure in this country."
Let me tell you something we run out of time here. I used to own property in Nova Scotia on the eastern coast.
Right.
And we went to Halifax to see fights a few times. Clyde Gray was fighting, but he wasn't there. Dave Downey was the big star.
Right.
And of course, it was a very racially charged place at the time. Civil rights were just coming in. This is in the 70s. But Dave Downey was very good, very good. But he was happy with just being the middleweight champion of Canada. And he was a very sweet man. And we even went up to a mining town in Nova Scotia and saw a guy called, I think it was Barry Sponigal. You ever heard of him?
Right? Oh yeah.
Yeah, we took a long weekend and went up and saw him fight, and it was it was funny. It was in a minor league hockey rink. They filled the place. What else can you do in Stellarton? That's what it was, Stellarton.
Stellarton's the home of Art Hafey.
Yeah, right. And when we pulled into the motel we'd rented, there were two guys fighting in the parking lot. We thought, oh, this is going to be a good show. But the funny thing was that the crowd thought the fighters were great. They thought their fighters were really, really good. And I mean, Sponigal was just an average fighter, and he was way better than anybody else on the card. And I was involved in managing fighters a little bit at that time. And I told the promoter that, I can send some good fighters up here. He said, we don't want good fighters up here. But yeah, so I have actually, I think maybe about 3 or 4.
You should go to Prince Edward Island if you get a chance and go to Charlottetown.
Oh, yeah?
Which is where it's the birthplace of Canada. You could walk Charlottetown in an hour or two. That's how small it is, Nigel. But the nicest people, the cheapest seafood on earth, and like in Nova Scotia, just very, very friendly. The reason there's that racial tension, it goes all the way back to George Dixon, when there was a place called Africville, and the city
right.
And got rid of it. And so from Nova Scotia, you have, as obviously you know, George Dixon, Sam Langford, Mysterious Billy Smith.
They all got out of town.
Right. And all through Boston. And Art Hafey, of course, who beat Ruben Olivares, and nicest guy. And
he was a good fighter, but who was it that knocked him out? Finished his career pretty much.
Well, you know what happened? People don't know the story behind that. Danny Little Red Lopez.
Yeah, that's who it was, yeah.
And what happened was Art fought his whole career with Thompson's disease, which is a neurological disease which would make his body freeze up. So he wouldn't be able to move. And he came back because he was in San Diego fighting for Don Jargon. So he came back and he would walk. He couldn't move. He'd be in the street and somebody would say, just get on the sidewalk. But he couldn't physically move. And he had
that throughout his fighting career?
Throughout his career. So,
wow.
So he went to see a neurosurgeon and he said, you shouldn't be in the ring with this. This could happen to you anytime, and there's nothing we can do. And he still fought, and I was very upset with Richard Steele because he fought a rematch of Olivares, and one judge had it 8-7, I think, Olivares. The other had it 8-7 for Art, and then Richard Steele had it 14-1 for Olivares. So I said to him,
you mentioned Richard Steele, okay? This is something. A lot of people asked me, how do you beat Floyd Mayweather? And I said, well, the first thing you've got to do is find a referee who won't let him clinch 20 times around. It was jab, right hand, clinch. And who was his referee? Steele.
Yeah.
So can I prove that he was doing it? I can't. But it's too much to be a coincidence. Let's put it that way.
I agree. I said to him at the hall one year, he said, well, that was a bad night. I said, 14-1 is not a bad night. I said, you either did it deliberately or you were paid off, but there's no other option.
Now,
14-1.
He didn't freeze up the second fight, just the first fight, right?
Yeah.
And I used to like watching Art's fights. They were exciting.
Me too. I have a DVD of his that I can send you, and his nephew did, and he had it happen during the Arguello fight, and he had it happen during Lopez, and he was very upset because he thought he could beat Lopez. But after that, I mean, he made very little money, and and I'm sure you've seen this. He's in Halifax, and so he had a heart attack last year, but
Oh, did
he's,
he?
yeah, he's doing all right. But in his era, as you know, he made nothing as a featherweight, so he had to fight. Doctor said you cannot fight Lopez, and he said I'm getting $25,000. I can't turn it down. And Arguello was 15 grand, so he took
That
the
was
40.
pretty good in those days, really.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, and he bought a small apartment complex, 3-story, maybe 15 units, and he's lived off that since the middle 70s,
Well,
and
he
he's
was
expanded
smart.
on it.
He was smart. Yeah.
And
Bernard Hopkins has a lot of rental property. I mean, it'd be an exaggeration to say he's got the first dime he ever owned.
right,
But he was very disciplined. I know Bernard Hopkins very well, and I think he was the greatest middleweight since Hagler.
oh, I agree. Angelo Dundee said he was the best trained fighter he ever saw in his entire life.
Now he was a lot. He was very similar to Bud Crawford. That
Hmm.
they learned everything. That's why Roy Jones kept getting knocked out when he slowed down a bit. He never learned that stuff. He just
Right.
had this wonderful reflexes and speed, but he didn't learn the basics of boxing. And Bernard and Bud are the two that I can associate together to guys that actually they could do everything. And Bernard would openly say oh, the last quarter of his career, he had the same plan every fight, and that was take what the other guy does best away. That's the only way he could win.
Yeah, that's brains. I mean, that's his most potent weapon. When he was in Toronto promoting his fight with Jean Pascal, and I think one of the fights was a draw. I think the first fight.
Yeah, the first one. Yeah.
And when I asked, like in the media room in Montreal, I said to Bernard, "How can you stand there and be calm when you won the fight and they ripped you off?" And of course, being a Canadian with all these French Canadians and other Canadians, I thought they were going to tear me apart. But that's what I thought. And I asked him, I said, "You fought Jermaine Taylor twice, you beat him twice, and you got ripped off. How do you come back from that mentally?" And he said, "You can't pin your whole life on one thing like that and
Right.
wreck the rest of your life. You have to accept it for what it is, put it in its place, and keep going."
I mean, he's I like him. We've been semi friends for a long time, but he's not always nice. um, he didn't get married until he won the middleweight title. The discipline he had after getting out of prison was unreal. I don't know if you know, he got a job. The only job he got was washing dishes in a hotel in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been there for, I think, a year or a little bit more. And they found out that he didn't put on his application form that he had a felony. And they fired him, even though he was a good employee. And he didn't know what to do. And then sort of Lady Luck stepped in. Bowie Fisher, who was a trainer, actually, he made his living. He had a shop that repaired transmissions. And he said to Bernard, "You come work with me." He said, "I don't know anything about transmissions." He says, "I'll teach you." And Bowie was, I liked Bowie. He was a really nice, friendly guy. And we always used to talk. Um, but of course, Bernard screwed him. I mean, he was as ruthless in some ways outside the ring as he was inside. But I
Right.
have tremendous respect for a man. He had like his parole was like double figures. I don't know if it was 10, 12, or what it was. It wasn't single figures. He couldn't, sneeze for all those years, well over a decade. And, he just, Just never did nothing after that except fight. There's a lot of guys that are in prison come out, and it's they're right back to their old ways after a while. Tony Ayala,
Yeah.
uh, he was a tragic. He was abused as a child, and as you know, that victims become perpetrators very often, very often.
Everyone thought he was going to be the guy to give Hagler his biggest fight, even
I
though
don't
he was
think so.
in your middle.
Yeah, I mean, Hagler was a good defensive fighter when he
Hmm.
wanted to be. I mean, I think his fight with Mugabe was in a way harder than the fight with Hearns because it went on a long time.
Hmm.
And I think those two fights finished him. He was,
Yeah.
well, he only had one fight with Ray Leonard afterwards. Excuse me. But there were certain things you can see, and I'm sure you've seen it on great fighters who are past their peak. They push their punches instead of snapping them. And that's the first thing I saw when, he would get Leonard on the ropes and go to the body, but it wasn't like he used to go to the body. He was pushing his punches.
He
And
was
well,
slow.
he also gave away the first 3 rounds, which
Yeah,
wasn't
which you
too
can't
bright.
do.
And that was interesting. He wanted a 15 rounder.
Right.
Now maybe he would have won a 15 round. Who knows? Leonard didn't, and they gave Bernard another $1 million, and he took the money instead of the 3 rounds.
Well, it's interesting. Angelo said he was shocked because he went in to He said Petronelli's were friends of mine, but they weren't good negotiators. And he said we wanted to cut 3 rounds, 9 minutes off the fight. We wanted a larger ring, and and he said they went sure because their attitude. He said it doesn't make a difference. Marvin's going to knock him out in the first 1 and 2 rounds anyways. What else? And he said Angelo just couldn't. He had to look at Ray and think, are they being? Is this like a big joke? You're going to do that? And he go, yeah, your guy's got nothing. We're going to take him out early. And he thought
I
that's
Yeah, I don't say this is perfectly true, but I think that Ray Leonard is probably the greatest fighter since Ali.
yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
he fought everybody. He didn't duck anybody. And boy, he was a pretty boy. He did commercials. I describe it. He had a Madison Avenue face, but boy, was he vicious. I mean,
yeah,
that the last knockout was the one with Lalonde, and
yeah,
Donnie knocked him down early. But boy,
I saw that.
the finish of that was unmerciful. And yeah, people think because he was such a nice guy and friendly and all that and good looking, but when that bell rang, he was a different guy. He was really a vicious fighter and a very accomplished boxer. So
I have to,
there's so many people you could put that tag on, but
I,
I
I have to
think
tell you something about Ray Leonard. Very close with Ian Clyde, a flyweight, and Ian was in Angelo's stable. And Ian's like Jiminy Cricket. It's always in a great mood, always calls you, never forgets your birthday. He's never forgotten my daughter's birthday, and he's never
that's
met her.
great.
And he's just the nicest guy. He has a bit of pugilistic dementia, but he's a great guy. Sometimes forgets to pay the rent. Sometimes, they'll ask him to move from where he is because he's forgotten to pay. And because he was in the Canadian Olympic team, he gets a pension, but he forgets to keep reapplying. Anyways, when I saw Ray at the Hall of Fame, I told him about this because he asked, "How's Ian?" And he said, "Do you have any contact?" And I gave it to him. And Ian, he called me in an hour later, and he went to see him a couple of days later, and he helped him out financially and helped him put a lot of stuff in order. He didn't have to do that,
No,
but he did. He said, "I love Ian. He's my brother." And I said to him, "I heard Ian knocked you down in training camp when you guys were sparring once, but he's a flyweight." He said, "You let him." And he said, "Well, you will never know the true answer."
I don't know. Philadelphia was very famous for the gym wars. It was
Which were
practically.
better, Angelo said, than most real fights.
Yeah, but the thing is, they still have them occasionally, but not when I first started going to the gym in the gyms in the late 60s. And for a long time when I was living in Philadelphia, it always makes it a lot easier, you know. I was at the gym 3, 4, 5 times a week. And so you get to know these guys. And I would say, you know, 90% of fighters are nice guys. You know, they really are, unless you're fighting them. It's in my tribute to Benny Briscoe, at the funeral when his brother spoke. I think his brother's a school teacher or a principal. And he said if Briscoe had $1 million, he wouldn't have a dime. He'd give it all away because he knew what it was to be hungry. And that's true. And that's why he was one of the early guys who shaved his head, because he had a rather large family and they would shave it off so they didn't have to get another haircut and pay some more money later.
Yeah,
And,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he'll always be my favorite fighter.
What is it about Philadelphia? I mean, Angelo said there's tough, super tough, and then Philly tough. And you could go back to Lou Tendler or even to Owen Ziegler in the 1880s. Why does Philadelphia produce so many world champions in every division that are phenomenally tough?
Well, you know, a lot of the fighters came with the Great Migration from down south. Like Joe Frazier wasn't from Philly, you know.
South Carolina, yeah.
Yeah, so Benny Briscoe wasn't from Philly. Bob Montgomery wasn't from Philly. They all came from down south. And Bob Montgomery was very lucid in his old age until maybe the last year. And he could tell you every penny he earned. He knew the purse for every fight he ever had, and knew the date. He knew the guy. And he was still very active. He made a lot of money fighting for those days, and he had a lot of businesses, laundries, barbershops, stuff like that. And he told me, he said he was a gambler. He said that I became the book. And you know, the book, you lose all your damn money unless you're really rich. So he, right up until he got, you know, really near the end, he would go to this bar in Philadelphia, down near where the stock exchange are, and all of those guys go in there for lunch, and he would take bets. He was still taking bets. He wasn't the book, but he was still taking bets. That's what he did every day. He'd go to that bar, and everybody loved him. A lot of people didn't know who he was. There was this character, friendly character. Right. And he used to, I tell you, I don't know if you know this. At one time in Philadelphia, the black writers could not sit ringside with the white fighters.
That I knew, yes.
And it was Bob Montgomery and his manager, Joe Granby, that stopped that. They said, we're not fighting. And that's, so, you know, besides a great fighter, he did do something like that.
It's like that in baseball.
He used to come to the Blue Horizon, and there was a bar very close, and he didn't always make it to the Blue Horizon. You know, he liked to drink. And sometimes after the fight, I'd be going down Broad Street in Philadelphia, and I'd see him on his own. And, you know, he wasn't walking that well. So I would pick him up and take him home. He never showed me where he lived. He said it was in like a sort of out Center City. He would just say, okay, this is great, I'll get out here. But he was a sweetheart. And inside the ring, that nickname, the Bobcat, was,
he was magnificent.
He'd do anything.
I mean, his fights with Ike Williams are some of the greatest fights of all time. I mean,
yeah, everybody remembers the one where he lost, but they forget the one that he won.
And
it was a matter of, like, he was in his prime, Ike wasn't, and then he was washed up, and Ike was in his prime. So, you know, who knows what would have happened if they both meet in their prime.
And I know that
The the fights with Bojack were really famous.
Wow.
They had the one during the war that set the biggest gate of all time. It's probably gone now, but it was for a long time because they were buying war bonds, the people to get in, and him and Bojack, they fought for nothing. They got $2,000 each to training expenses, but they made a huge amount of money, millions and millions. Of course, it was for a good cause. And when he was down on his luck, he went. I don't know what part of the government he went to, but he went to somebody in the government and told them who he was and how much money he'd given to charity. Could they help him? No, they didn't do nothing for him. They probably didn't even believe him. But so he took bets and he had a good time. He was very jolly guy. And his memory, I can't remember half the stuff I do, but he can remember the first to the last, every penny he earned and who he fought.
Wow.
Yeah.
There were so many fighters like that. I asked him about Tommy Bell, who Ray Robinson beat for the welterweight title.
Right.
And he said, Lou, there's so many great fighters like that. It tears me apart that people today don't know about them. How wonderful and how great these guys were.
Yeah, there is a small cult within the smaller, but larger cult of boxing that are interested in boxing history. That's why we have so many of these self-published bios,
right?
Boxers. So yeah, it is. It sort of fools you if you're involved in boxing as much as you and I are. Sometimes you just feel like everybody's like us, but of course they're not, and that's a shame. But like I say, the money's rolling in. This is something that I'm not very fond of. There is an active club scene in Philadelphia. A couple of casinos. There's a small arena called the 2300 Arena. There's 4 or 5 places that put on club shows. The prices are unreal. They start at $50, then $75. If you want to be ringside, $150 for a club fight.
Wow.
That's, you could sit ringside at Madison Square Garden for that not too long ago. And I don't know why they do that. Maybe, see, if you don't have TV for a club fight, you're only going to have so many people. So I guess
Right. I know here in Toronto, there's a promoter that what they do, United Promotions, is they get fighters to sell tickets because they don't get TV coverage.
Yeah, and well, a lot of all beginners, and when they fight on small clubs, they're poison if they can't sell tickets.
Right, and they hooked up with Eye of the Tiger Promotions to help each other in Montreal. But there are some stories. For instance, the original George Godfrey from PEI, Old Chocolate. His family's very wealthy because when he died, he owned a lot of land, and he told them never to sell it. He said you could have people build on it, never give the land away. And they still have that land in Boston, and they're still quite wealthy. And he died in 1904.
So did you interview these people for your Godfrey book?
I've spoken to his relatives, and I've spoken to the relatives of George Budge Byers as well, because the families are related.
Right.
And they're first cousins, George Byers and George Godfrey. And I've tracked George Byers' family to Virginia, colony of Virginia in the late 1600s. And then the slave owner that left because he had an affair with one of his female slaves went to South Carolina, and then the American Revolution broke out and was sent to Florida, kicked out of Florida by the Spanish, and then went to Jamaica. Didn't like the weather, and then took him and Byers' great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother from Jamaica to New Brunswick to Halifax and finally to Charlottetown, PEI. So
Yeah, I didn't know that Godfrey had left a lot of, well, land, but he knew that it was going to be money. You know, he told him not to sell it now.
yeah, and it's interesting when I see in the Hall of Fame, it kills me that they have Steve Williams, George Godfrey in there. They don't have the original George Godfrey. He was on the ballot, but I don't think many people knew who he was and didn't vote
Well,
for him.
you know, I've been voting ever since they started it. But there's a problem. The Boxing Writers Association of America, I don't belong to it, but anybody who is a member can vote on the Hall of Fame. They just carte blanche. Now, there are historians and people that know, but a lot of those people don't know boxing before Muhammad Ali, and some of them, they don't know boxing before Mike Tyson.
Right.
So that's why a lot of people, they see a famous name and they check the block. I've been doing this ever since they opened up, and every year I've got the old record book out. I got Box Rec on. I really spend a lot of time making my choices, but I think a lot of them, they just, okay, I've heard of that guy, that's. But the Hall of Fame, now that it's connected to the Turning Stone Casino, were you there the year they swore in 3 classes because of the pandemic?
No, I missed that year.
Yeah, they didn't have for 3 years, so they bought everybody who'd been voted in for 3 years, and a lot more is at the casino now than out on the grounds.
I had tickets, but I had to have a pacemaker put in, so I wasn't allowed out after, unfortunately.
How are you feeling now?
Well, now I feel a lot better. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, now it makes a world. I'm totally dependent on it, but it makes a world of difference. But
Yeah.
I used to go with Angelo, so I knew how lucky I was, because here I am, a boxing writer, but a nobody from Canada and nobody in Canada, and to befriend a person who I fell in love with was like a father to me, and take me here and introduce me to all these people. And my friends would say, so George Foreman and this person? No, Angelo knows him. And he was kind enough to introduce me, and I got to speak to him for a couple seconds. So
yeah, George Foreman in his second career was a very good interview. In his first career, I didn't interview him then, but when he, I think it was when he went into the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
He went in the Hall of Fame at the end of his second career, because they didn't even have it prior to that when he fought the first time. He said, because he was working for HBO, had some good gigs. I said, well, why did you quit? He said, I couldn't afford to keep doing it. His other businesses outside of boxing took all of his time,
NASCAR, dog breeding, horse breeding.
Yep. So George Foreman, to me, he's sort of like a guy, I think 100 years from now, he'll be like John Henry or Paul Bunyan, like a mystical figure. But I sort of think that way about him, because the way he's accomplished, what he did is amazing. Because before he beat Moore for the title, he lost convincingly to Evander Holyfield. He put up a good fight, but he didn't get close to winning. And there was another guy from New York who beat him.
Tommy Morrison beat him.
No, not Tommy Morrison.
Briggs.
It was
Shannon Briggs.
His face was terrible. Yeah.
So
he took some beatings.
Alex Stewart.
Yeah, that's it. Alex Stewart. I mean, he looked like he lost, and he might have lost, but they gave it to him. But I mean, those were 2 fights that he had on his comeback that he really took a lot of hard punches. and then to come back. And the thing with the Michael Moore fight, it's a typical example of being relaxed. I mean, it was just like, he's down. There was a right hand before the one to put him down. And if you
Right.
noticed, talking about Crawford again, his knockdowns they were just a little. They didn't wind up. He just threw that right hand out the first time. He just did it.
Mhm.
You know, it wasn't like winding up. He just boop, boop, a little short, perfect punch, and down you go. And that's because they can relax.
Yeah, Angelo said to him after the round before he knocked Moore out, "You're behind in rounds." And George told me he got angry. "Angelo, look at me. Look how I'm slower than an elephant. I can't win on rounds against anyone, even Mother Teresa. I have to knock him out. I know what I'm doing. Leave me
Yeah,
alone." And he was
yeah, he
trying
knew
his
what he was doing. He knew it
yeah,
was. And Michael Moore was not the most confident guy in the world either, but
no, and
he just took a punch and whew, he was gone.
Teddy Atlas kept telling him through the whole fight. He's saying, "Michael, he's trying to sucker you into a straight right. He keeps moving you over. Don't move." And Moore would say, "I'm going to knock him out." And he said, "No, you're not going to knock him out. Hit him and run." And
Right.
didn't listen. And Moore and Teddy Atlas had that great thing. I don't know if it might have been against Holyfield, where Moore comes back from the rounds over and Teddy's sitting on the chair,
Yeah.
right? And he says to him, "You only get this chance once in your life. I don't want to hear you tomorrow tell me get him again. Tomorrow is to now, right now. This is it. If you want it, do it. If you don't, we'll stop it."
Yeah,
I
I
mean, what a
mean
great
that
speech.
was that was made him the champion and made a lot of money, but the rematch was like he didn't fight at all. He gets how many times he
No,
get knocked down in the rematch?
quite
More,
a few.
yeah.
Yeah,
So what happened between? I don't know. That was the time that Holyfield claimed he had a hole in his heart or something, and
right. And it was
some
healed by
preacher
religion.
solved it for him.
Yeah,
But Holyfield, he fought everybody, man. He
yeah.
fought everybody. He was,
I know as a Canadian, I was watching the fight, the first one of Lennox, and Lennox definitely beat him.
oh,
And the way I have that in my book, but the way they ripped him off. And then I was reading, with Eugenia Williams, how a newspaper in England said that she'd been paid off, that Don King had paid her mortgage and she was behind it. She lost her house and then paid her bills. So she sued and she won.
yeah,
And when I spoke to a friend in England, he said, "Well, he said that's not really a comment on the newspaper's comments. It's a comment on how poor the British judicial system is." My friend said, "You have to remember this. In the 1950s, an English newspaper called Liberace a flaming homosexual. He sued and he won.
yeah.
So you have
Well,
to
they had
wonder."
this. They had the system in England. If you sue somebody, whoever wins got to pay the other person's legal bills.
Right.
So you don't have as many fishing expeditions, like people suing people. They know they're. Well, we had it at the ring once. It made no sense whatsoever. It was even before I worked there. Um, there was a mention of somebody who had a knife, and it wasn't even on the same page as the people who were suing us, right? So they were in California, we were in New York, so it would have cost us more to hire a lawyer in California and go to court than it would be to give this guy a couple of grand. So they're fishing expeditions, knowing
Yeah.
that it costs a lot of money, and that is a good thing about the British judicial system, that the
Mhm.
loser pays the other guy's bills.
Right.
But the
Yeah.
fact that Liberace was gay was true, but I don't.
Right.
I guess he couldn't prove it.
No. And
Of course, it might be before they even changed the law,
Well, he
because,
had evidence. The writer had evidence. They just wouldn't allow him to present it.
yeah, well, maybe the judge was in the bag. I don't know.
Well,
But
that's funny. I have 4 cousins that are lawyers, so I've been lucky in that respect. Not that I've ever needed them a lot. But one of my cousins it was retired now, but he was a copyright lawyer, and he said to me,
uh-huh.
it doesn't come down to who's right or wrong. It comes down to how you manipulate the facts in your best interest.
Yeah.
And various things. I'd written an article years ago for a local Toronto magazine about the do's and don'ts of dating, and uh, and the person acknowledged it and said thank you, but we're going to give the byline to another writer. We're trying to help a female writer, and spoke to my cousin, and he said, well, you're not going to sue because the money they were going to pay you anyways, it's not going to be worth it. And he said, and it ends up he knows the lawyer for the company, for the magazine. He tells them they can't do it, and calls me a day later and said, well, it doesn't matter anyways. The magazine just filed for bankruptcy. They're broke.
Yeah.
So your
Yeah,
article
you
wouldn't
can't get
come out.
money out of anybody that's bankrupt.
No. So
And
now,
it's a shame. I mean,
did
like
you?
when, Don King stole a lot of money from Mike Tyson, and Tyson
Mhm.
sued him. And I think he got over $10 million from Don King, but the IRS took it all away from him. He was that far behind in his taxes. So,
It's unbelievable when I could not believe, Nigel, this stunned me. When Ali fought Frazier the first time, they're each getting 2.5 million. And my father shows me a newspaper and it says, but they left with 750 grand each. And I said, how can it be? And he said, training camp expenses and IRS. They're the real mafia.
yeah,
They'll,
the
they'll kill
IRS,
everything.
that's big. Training camp can be expensive, but not that expensive. Of course, when they quote a purse, going to make such amount of money, that doesn't mean the fighter gets that. I
Right.
mean, taxes aside, uh, the promoter is going to get a piece, the manager is going to get a piece, the trainer is going to get a piece, sparring partners are going to get a piece. So, and the income tax bracket that the really big time fighters are ridiculous how much money they take. A purse is for publicity, I think, sometimes, and
It's
then
the
when it comes
opposite in
down to the
Canada.
pay, well, I don't know if you read Russell Peltz's book, uh,
Yes.
uh, the story of how he got the title, $30 in a cut eye.
Yeah. It wasn't worth it.
I think the purse was probably $50.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh
So,
yeah. I read his book, William Deadloff's book, and your book back to back to back.
well, Russell's book, it's unique. It reminded me of a diary. Um, and it was written like a reporter would write, not like a columnist, or because that's what he was. He was got a journalism degree from Temple
Right.
University and worked on newspapers, but it was a good idea, and I mean that's how it seemed to me, that it was a diary of all of his fights. There wasn't
It was
really a
a
lot of
wonderful read.
fighting, but it was a very interesting. I knew a lot of it, of course, but
I'll
to
tell you
people to
though.
like do some research on some of the, it'd be what I guess I'm saying, it would be a great resource to people who are trying to, get some facts and figures, and to
Well,
help
there were
their pieces out.
there was something in his book and yours that had me shaking in fear. In his book, it's when the guy broke in and put a gun to his head.
Ah, yes.
And in your book, when you had to walk into the house where that mobster is, you get him to sign it over. I mean, I would have had to be honest with you, I would probably had a stroke or a heart attack.
Well,
I wouldn't have made it
something
to the
that
front door.
I think it was Don Stradley wrote in the review of my book, and I'd never thought of this. He said, Nigel seems comfortable and every situation he describes in the book, and he names some of them, And I thought, well, I don't really think that way. My way of thinking is kind of strange, I guess. Whatever I'm doing, okay, this is what we're doing now. It doesn't. I get more upset because I can't work my computer,
Right.
really, than anything else. But yeah, I guess you could say it was comfortable, but I don't think of it as comfortable. I just think of, okay, we're doing this now. I was more afraid when Alfonso threatened me in the gym, because when we went to do the money thing, he was just standing there. But
Right.
and when he took our money for the fight down in Maryland, um, I wasn't going to argue. But we finally got it, of course. But yeah, Arnold Giovanetti was an interesting guy. I mean, he obviously got bumped off, and
Mhm.
you don't find your car at the airport and nobody ever hears or sees from you again. He wasn't a made man or anything like that. He had one of those jobs where you just clock in and clock out. There's a name for that, you don't get paid. And I noticed that he could always get publicity for his fighters on TV.
Right.
And they weren't always great fighters. I remember Roger Russell was a fighter of his who was, pretty worn out by then. He would get him on TV. So I don't know exactly what he was doing, but whatever it was, it got him killed. This is bad. I'm just joking, people who watch this.
Well, I know that.
Russell and I always joke that it was Alfonso Heyman that killed him, but I'm not accusing him. That was just a joke. But who knows?
Right. I know that when I've gone to fights, there's a man here in Toronto named Marvin Elkin, and Marvin drove for Jimmy Hoffa for years, and Vito Genovese, and nice little tiny old Jewish guy, and but my father knew him from school in the 30s, and so he's almost like a stepfather to me. So when I would see him at the fights, and hi, how are you, and I would meet his friends, he would just say, "Stay away from them," and then he'd say to them, "Stay away from the kid." And I said, "Why should I stay away from them? Just stay away from them. They're not good people." But you're with them.
Yeah.
That's my job, to be with them.
There's also another thing too. Um, some people that are involved in organized crime, they're better behaved in their boxing aspect of their lives than the rest of it.
Right.
Um, I think, they respect the fighters. And, it's nice to brag to their buddies that they got a piece of this guy and that guy and all. Now, I think obviously when they robbed Russell at gunpoint was very scary. But when
Yeah.
they firebombed his office,
Scarier. That's the message.
yeah, so he was at a fight, I think, up in Connecticut, but his assistant Maureen and her boyfriend were there, and they could have burned to death, but they it was hard to raise them. People pounding on the door and yelling and screaming, and they finally did, and a lot of memorabilia, expensive memorabilia, was burned.
Tell me about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was. I mean, nothing like that's ever happened to me for any reasons. But yeah, I always have a suspect in these things. I'm not saying it, of course, but who knows? Nobody was ever caught, and I'm sure the guys that threw the actual Molotov cocktails were not the people; they were just hired. And
Right.
they just caught the guys a month or so ago that stole the belts from the Hall of Fame.
Really?
Yeah, they were part of a gang that was robbing historical things and stuff. That was their specialty. And they were stupid. They thought the belts were made out of gold. They're not. So they tried to melt it down, and they had nothing. But I don't know if the whole gang got caught. But the two guys that did that have been caught and been arrested. I don't know if they had a trial or yet. But
Well,
that was terrible for the families. the
Yes,
Zell
and I got.
family and the Basilio family,
I
because
would.
that was huge having the belt.
Well, and those were gorgeous belts. Those belts and the Lonsdale belts are the prettiest belts I've ever seen.
Well,
You know.
when the ring belt was first made in that very recognizable design, when Nat Fleischer was running, they were actually made by a jeweler. As time went on, there was no money for jewelers. And I think the Lonsdale belts are still made by a jeweler. And,
Well,
Lord Lonsdale was a real prick, but
yeah.
he
I,
a prick and a bully, but he loved boxing. And
I have to tell you about 2 years ago, I was surfing on the net and I saw Basilio's belts up for sale in England. So I called my cousin. He said, "Well, don't comment on the page; they'll take it down." He said, "Call the person you know at the Hall of Fame and send them the link." And I did. I don't think it did anything, but
well,
I just thought,
there are replicas. There's some people that make replica belts and sell them. Now
right.
that's okay if you tell the person it's a replica, but the guy thinks he's got Joe Louis's belt or something, and he doesn't.
It's like having a replica orgasm. It's not really quite as good as the
The real thing, yeah.
original. Yeah.
Actually, there was actually a person who was selling replica ring belts at the Hall of Fame during the weekend.
Wow.
Yeah, I told the publisher. The publisher told the owner, and they did nothing. So what are you going to do? It's that's all you can do. But
Right.
they didn't even try to get it stopped. So, but
That's sad.
anyway,
People, do that.
we're going to
Listen,
have
I
to do
want.
this a game someday.
Yes, thank you. You're my hero, and I waited so long to speak to you and to be able to say thank you in person.
I hope I
And
wasn't a disappointment.
no, you were fantastic. It's funny how people as brilliant as you always say that, but you were fantastic. I wish, my wish is that you and Russell and Bill Detloff would do a podcast on Sirius XM because you guys would get millions of listeners from all over the world. And
Yeah, I mean, it's when we have an all sports radio station here in Philadelphia, and when it first started out, Russell actually had a show, and it was very good, and but they won't even mention boxing on there now. When you did to get on with the person. You've got to go through a producer. And if they want to talk about boxing, they won't send it through, except on that same
it shouldn't have,
station.
but that
I,
shouldn't apply to you. You're a world-renowned, award-winning fighter or fighter
well,
writer who everyone knows.
nobody who's on the air now on that station knows much about boxing. Very, very little. And they don't want to learn either. But actually, I think it was last Sunday, I did get on there. There's a guy called Sonny Hill. He's 88 years old. And he was very big in basketball in this city. He ran a league at one time. And I don't know what all of his accomplishments are. But on Sundays, he's on from, I think, 7 till 10. And he will talk about boxing. And so fortunately, I got on there. I'm hoping that it opened up a new market, old guys. You know what I mean? Because that's all, I agree with him about some of the stuff he says. But that's because, I'm sort of his age.
But you're also in that.
Wilt Chamberlain, right? That's always
Right.
a controversy with him. A lot of people think that Wilt Chamberlain couldn't play today and couldn't do the things he could today. I saw Wilt Chamberlain play.
Wow.
He would have been absolutely fantastic today. He would, well, they changed the rules for him.
Mm-hmm.
He would go up to dunk the ball. He'd have two guys hanging on him, and the referee wouldn't call a foul. It was a rough game back then. Basketball was a lot rougher.
Oh yeah. Jerry West.
then.
Jerry West said that too. He said LeBron James, Michael Jordan, He
When
said
somebody
nothing.
went down on the floor in those days, it was for real. They weren't just flopping to get a foul.
Well,
And
Jerry West said the guys today couldn't stop Wilt Chamberlain. He
yeah,
said,
I mean, it's a different era. I don't like comparing boxers from different eras because it's not
right.
really fair. But I'll always stick up for Wilt Chamberlain. He was amazing. They beat the Celtics for the championship one day. I forget what year it was, but I think I was still in school. But I went to one of the games. I knew a family that
Wow.
would take me to stuff, and yeah, Wilt was really something. And
Have you seen the documentary on him?
nobody's made the 100 points, have they, since him? I think
No,
somebody came
not even
up.
close.
Well, Wilt
The
Chamberlain,
documentary
I think it was Customato was trying to make a match between Wilt Chamberlain
and
and
Ali.
yeah, I mean, there's that picture of him, like, Wilt Chamberlain's way up here and Ollie's down here. It's really funny. Of course, it never happened.
Well, do you know
Um,
what Ali said to him when they were about to sign? Apparently, Ali yelled out "Timber"
yeah.
and looked at him and
He,
said, "Why do you think just because you're much taller than me that I won't destroy you?"
do you know the athletes that are closest to boxers? And they're not really thought of as athletes, but they are dancers.
Really?
Yeah. Footwork's everything in boxing.
Right.
Um, you know, Footwork is a
Balance,
lost art,
leverage.
but those that can do it, you know, you saw Bud Crawford do it. He
Yeah.
didn't wasn't running around. He was just stepping, creating angles. Boxing is all about angles and footwork. Because Teddy Atlas used to say on TV, it doesn't matter how big of a bomb you've got to have a way to land it.
Yeah.
And that's very, very true. And boxing is more complicated, but simpler than people think. It's a
Right.
fight. That's all it
And
is. But the techniques are very complicated if you're very good at it.
I always think of Charlie Goldman, Rare Cell, Angelo Dundee, Eddie Futch, Jack Blackburn, Doc Bagley, who you mentioned is probably the first modern trainer, and all these guys. And when I hear people, it must drive you nuts when people, because I was talking to Russell about this, when people comment on fights and this is what really happened, and you see it and you think, I was at that fight, but you said it had nothing to do with what actually happened. So it's always that revisionist history. And I always, when I see you comment online, I think, Nigel covered the fight. How can you disagree with him?
Well, it's funny in that story that we all like 10% off the top.
Mm-hmm.
The first death threat was at Jimmy Arthur's gym. And Jimmy Arthur, his big fighter he had was Tyrone Everett, who got
Great fighter.
shot. Um, it's kind of strange, but Russell calls him the greatest trainer you've never heard of.
Right.
That was Jimmy Arthur. And he was a great trainer. And he did things that, he some would make some of his money. He would take opponents up to Scranton or something like that. And he had a lot of fighters that were the B side, but he always tried to figure out a way they could win or look good. It didn't always work, but he really tried to help them to do something. And he also was pretty smart. He said that when I overtook a guy, I always took a couple of his corner boys up with us. So he couldn't go back to Philly and say he was robbed. you know.
Right.
So I knew him. I really liked Jimmy Arthur. He was very, very smart. Um, Here's a little story about the kind of man I think he was. It was at the Blue Horizon, and he had a fighter that was making his pro debut. And I just gone down to the dressing room to say hi to him. Everybody called him Art. And this kid was upset. And he was upset because he had a hole in his sock. And he thought everybody was going to see it and he'd be embarrassed. So Jimmy Arthur just got down on his knees and he folded the sock over so you couldn't see it. And that really impressed me. Most guys say, okay, it doesn't make any difference, nobody's going to look at the hole in your sock. But he knew that the kid was upset and he had a better chance of winning. And I don't remember whether he did or not, if he wasn't worried about his sock. And that's what he did. He just got down on his knees and folded his sock over.
There's so many wonderful people like that in the sport that deserve to be remembered.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Bill Miller, another one who trained James Toney and Saxon, and
a
lot of those guys. Where can they get your book? Your book is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble?
Yeah, that's most places you can get it. The next signing I have is at the Atlantic City Boxing Hall of Fame. It's 30th September.
Okay.
Some of my friends were giving me a suggestion. I guess it was yesterday, but I haven't followed up on it. It was just one last thing I'll tell you. When I published Boxing Babylon, that's back when there were bookstores and real publishers and stuff. They sent around to all the radio stations a little booklet about the books that they were publishing, and so I got like maybe 25 or more interviews on the radio. They weren't all huge markets, but they were all places you'd heard of, And I said to my editor, "Are these going to help?" He says, "Well, they're not going to hurt." But talking to my current editor, that did this book for me, he said podcasts have replaced that. So you have replaced a radio show. Okay. And I really appreciate coming on because we're going to sit here and talk boxing for hours.
Yes,
so let me know when your book comes out.
I will. I will send you a copy, and no one will replace you. That's what I wanted to say. You are the preeminent boxing writer of this century and of the last century. And I would say you're up there on the Mount Rushmore of boxing writers.
Well, that's very nice, but I have to tell you, I have imposter syndrome. You know what that is, right?
Yes.
And Bill Detloff said to me, "You've got the worst case of imposter syndrome I've ever known," and it's true, but it drives me. It drives me to be better. And I always tell you that people, my secret is I'm insecure. So,
well, I wouldn't know that from talking to you, but there's so many great boxing writers out there that you can see, including me. I'm not saying I'm a great boxer, but you know what I'm saying, that they can see you can see your influence on them.
Yeah, I guess I something. When I'm writing, I know the subject. Okay, I make it up as I go along.
Right.
I mean, that's I don't do an outline. I may make a few notes, but I actually make it up as I go along. That's just the way I do it. That's not for everybody.
Right. But, you have to do what feels best for you.
Yeah, you gotta, and some people, I tell them, "Oh, it's all lies. I made it all up."
Right.
They look at me and laugh. But hey, boxing has done a lot for me. It hasn't made me rich, but it's made my life very enjoyable. And I've done a lot of things and been a lot of places and seen a lot of things that other people haven't. And when I'm feeling down in the dumps or depressed, I think about that. Hey, you've done all this stuff, and a lot of people could never have done that. So whatever I am, and I don't know. I'm not going to change. But listen, say hello to all the Canadian boxing fans for me.
There's I will.
Somebody out there. And I think the Maritimes was big at one time.
Yeah, but it was.
Now it's Montreal. I mean, Montreal is it.
For a long time. It's the hot.
I went up there for a fight. It was great. I liked Montreal.
Montreal's really the only European city in Canada. It's open 24 hours a day. And
it is.
It's whatever you want, whenever you want, at any time of the day.
Yeah, I liked it. I enjoyed it a lot. I want to go back one day. All right, listen, I got to go.
Okay, thank you so much.
This is
my
great.
pleasure. Thank you.
You don't have a link or anything that I can put this online?
Yes. I will get a link later today, and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, and I'll send it out. I'll give you some publicity. I couldn't I couldn't do it beforehand because I didn't even know my computer was going to work.
Right.
So I'll definitely put it out there for you.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's been so lovely getting to know you and talking with you. And we'll do
Oh
it again.
yeah, it is. We're just like two boxing guys,
Yeah.
and we're
Thank
we're
you.
rare. We're rare that love to
Yes,
listen.
but thank God. It makes life more interesting.
Okay, hope everybody that listened enjoyed it. If not, when I sell my book to somebody, I always say, I hope you like it, but if you don't, you're not getting your money back.
I
All
loved
right,
it.
take care,
People
man.
like you.
I'm
You
turning you
too.
off. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Be well. Bye bye. Okay, Mike. Mike, you there? Michael.